In a small, sleepy town called Pine Ridge, life moved at its own unhurried pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees, and the air carried the faint smell of fresh bread from the local bakery every morning. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. Among these familiar faces lived a woman who had become part of the background over the years. She wasn't flashy or loud. She preferred to keep to herself, blending into the fabric of the community like an unnoticed thread. This woman worked as a librarian in the town's only library, tucked away on the corner of Main Street. Her days were spent organizing books, helping kids find their favorite stories, and occasionally sipping coffee while flipping through novels during quiet afternoons. To her neighbors, she seemed ordinary, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose and hair tied back in a loose bun. No one gave her much thought, beyond polite nods at the grocery store or casual greetings when passing by. But beneath this calm exterior lay mysteries that no one in Pine Ridge could have guessed. For starters, she hadn't always lived there. About 10 years ago, she'd arrived out of nowhere, moving into a modest house on the edge of town without explanation. There were whispers back then, rumors about her past, but those quickly faded as time went on. People assumed she was running from something, maybe a bad marriage or financial troubles. Whatever it was, it didn't seem important enough to dig deeper. What truly set her apart, though, was something even she tried hard to hide. Faint scars along her arms, barely visible unless you looked closely. And then there was the tattoo on her wrist, a small emblem etched in faded ink, almost blending with her skin. Most people never noticed it because she kept her sleeves rolled down most of the time. Even if someone did catch a glimpse, they probably wouldn't think twice. After all, tattoos weren't uncommon these days. Life in Pine Ridge continued predictably until one crisp autumn morning when two strangers showed up in town. One was a tall man with sharp features and an air of authority, dressed in a neatly pressed suit. The other was younger, carrying a clipboard and looking nervous. They drove straight to the library, parking their sleek black car right outside. As soon as they stepped inside, heads turned. Strangers didn't visit Pine Ridge often, especially not ones who looked so official. The librarian, the woman everyone thought they knew, was shelving books when the older man approached her. His voice was firm but low, commanding attention. Without raising it, "We need to speak with you," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. She froze for a moment, her hand hovering mid-air near a stack of novels. Something in his tone told her this wasn't a casual visit. For a brief second, his gaze flickered to her left arm, where the scars peeked out slightly from under her sleeve. Then his eyes shifted to her wrist, zeroing in on the emblem tattoo. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by shock. He dismissed his younger companion with a wave and leaned closer to her, lowering his voice further. "Do you know what this means?" he asked, pointing discreetly at the tattoo. She hesitated, her heart pounding. This was the moment she'd feared for years, the moment someone would ask questions she couldn't answer easily. But instead of replying, she simply stared at him, waiting for him to continue. Word traveled fast in Pine Ridge. By lunchtime, half the town was buzzing with speculation. Who were those men? Why were they talking to her? And why did they look so serious? Some folks joked that she must have been some kind of spy, while others whispered darker theories. Maybe she deserted the military or committed a crime. The phrase "washed-up soldier" started floating around, though no one really knew what it meant. Despite the growing curiosity, she remained silent. When asked directly, she shrugged off the questions with vague answers like, "It's nothing important," or "just leave it alone." But deep down, she knew this wasn't going to blow over like previous rumors. Something big was brewing, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Casting long shadows across the town, she sat alone in her living room, staring at the tattoo on her wrist. Memories flooded back, memories she'd worked so hard to bury. She remembered the cold nights, the endless marshes, the sound of gunfire echoing in her ears. She remembered faces she hadn't seen in decades, voices she'd never hear again. And she remembered the mission, the one that changed everything. Whatever peace she'd found in Pine Ridge was crumbling now. The emblem on her wrist wasn't just a mark. It was a key to secrets buried deep within classified files and locked vaults. Secrets that powerful people wanted to uncover, and some wanted to stay hidden forever. That night, she made a decision. Whether she liked it or not, her quiet life was over. The next morning, the woman from Pine Ridge found herself sitting in a small, dimly lit room at a government building far from her quiet little town. The tall man with the commanding presence, the one who had shown up at the library, was pacing back and forth, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His younger aide sat quietly in the corner, scribbling notes on a clipboard. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel their eyes boring into her as if trying to peel back the layers of her carefully guarded past. For a while, no one spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally, the older man stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You have something on your wrist," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Something that shouldn't exist anymore." She glanced down at the faded emblem tattooed on her skin. It was small, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. To most people, it might have looked like an ordinary design, a few lines forming what appeared to be some kind of insignia. But to those who knew what they were seeing, it meant something far more significant. That emblem, the man continued, leaning closer, belongs to Operation Shadow Strike. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Officially, that mission never happened. And yet here you are, carrying proof that it did. Her stomach tightened. She'd spent years trying to forget about Operation Shadow Strike, burying the memories so deep that even she rarely thought about them. But now, faced with this man's piercing gaze and the undeniable truth etched into her skin, there was no escaping it. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about something much bigger. "I don't know what you want me to say," she replied cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've moved on. I left all of that behind." The man shook his head, frustration creeping into his expression. "You can't move on from something like this," he said sharply. "Not when lives are still at stake." At first, she didn't understand what he meant. How could events from over a decade ago still matter? But then he began explaining, piecing together fragments of information that painted a picture far more complex and dangerous than she'd imagined. Operation Shadow Strike, he told her, had been one of the most secretive and high-risk missions ever undertaken. A select group of soldiers had been sent deep into enemy territory to retrieve critical intelligence. The stakes were astronomical, and failure wasn't an option. Official reports claimed the mission ended in disaster. All operatives lost, their bodies never recovered. That's what the public believed anyway. What actually happened was buried under layers of classified documents and denials. But according to recent intelligence, remnants of the enemy network targeted during Shadow Strike were resurfacing. These weren't isolated incidents. They were coordinated efforts, suggesting someone or something was pulling strings from the shadows. Whoever it was had access to resources and knowledge that should have died along with the original operation. And that's where she came in. "You're the only living link we have to Shadow Strike," the man explained. "Your survival isn't just remarkable, it's unprecedented. If anyone can help us piece together what went wrong and stop whatever's happening now, it's you." She listened intently, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to refuse to shut down the conversation. and walk away. After everything she'd endured, she deserved peace, didn't she? But another part of her couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of responsibility tugging at her conscience. If what this man said was true, if innocent lives were at risk because of unfinished business from her past, how could she turn her back? Still, she hesitated. Trust didn't come easily to her, especially not after everything she'd been through. "Why now?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "If this has been going on for years, why are you coming to me today?" The man sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because we're running out of time," he admitted. "Whoever is behind this is escalating. Fast. We need answers, and we need them before things spiral completely out of control." As much as she wanted to argue, she knew he was right. The pieces fit together too perfectly. The resurgence of old enemies, the sudden reappearance of figures from her past, the eerie feeling that she'd been watched for longer than she realized. This wasn't coincidence. Something was brewing, and whether she liked it or not, she was caught in the middle of it. Reluctantly, she agreed to cooperate, but only on her terms. "I'll help," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "But I'm not doing it for you or for anyone else. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." The man nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Fair enough," he replied. "But understand this. Once you step back into this world, there's no turning back. Are you ready for that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the emblem on her wrist, tracing its faded outline with her fingertip. It had been a constant reminder of everything she'd lost, everything she'd fought for. Now, it seemed, it would also be the key to unlocking secrets that had haunted her for years. "I guess we're about to find out," she murmured softly. Over the next few days, she was taken to a secure facility where analysts pored over every detail she provided. She recounted harrowing stories of treacherous terrains, close calls, and moments of sheer terror. She described faces she hadn't seen in decades, places she'd hoped never to revisit, and strategies that had kept her alive when others hadn't been so lucky. What surprised her most was how vividly the memories returned. They came rushing back like floodwaters breaking through a dam, overwhelming her senses. Nights were the hardest. When the lights went out and the world grew silent, she found herself reliving scenes she'd worked so hard to bury. Sleep became elusive, replaced by restless tossing and turning as nightmares clawed their way into her subconscious. Despite the emotional toll, her contributions proved invaluable. Every word she spoke matched perfectly with fragmented reports, locked away in classified archives. Analysts marveled at her precision, her ability to recall details that had been deemed irretrievable. Even the man who had first approached her seemed astonished by the depth of her knowledge. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, doubts began creeping in. Was she truly helping, or was she being used? Could she trust these people who had suddenly reappeared in her life after so many years? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen once her usefulness ran out? These questions weighed heavily on her mind, but she pushed them aside for now. One step at a time, she reminded herself. She couldn't afford to dwell on uncertainties when so much depended on her. Little did she know, the journey ahead would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The days at the secure facility started blending together, each one filled with endless questions, maps spread across tables, and screens flickering with satellite images. The woman from Pine Ridge found herself at the center of it all, her quiet life replaced by a whirlwind of activity. She wasn't just sharing stories anymore. She was piecing together clues that could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. Every morning, she'd walk into the briefing room where analysts and officers were already gathered around a large table covered in documents, photographs, and digital devices. At first, they treated her like an outsider, someone who had stumbled into their world by accident. But as the days passed, their skepticism began to fade. Every piece of information she provided checked out perfectly. Her instincts were sharp, her memory uncanny, and her insights often left even the most seasoned experts speechless. One particular day stood out. A young officer, barely out of training, challenged her during a strategy session. "How do we know you're not making this up?" he asked bluntly, his tone laced with doubt. "You've been out of the game for years. What can you possibly teach us?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at her, waiting for her response. For a moment, she felt the sting of his words. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her credibility, but there was something about this kid's arrogance that struck a nerve. Instead of snapping back, though, she took a deep breath and walked over to the map pinned on the wall. Without hesitation, she pointed to a cluster of red dots scattered across the terrain. "These are supply routes," she said calmly, her voice steady. "They look random, but they're not. See the pattern? They converge here at this abandoned factory." She tapped the spot firmly. "That's where they'll be hiding their command center." The young officer frowned, glancing at the map skeptically. "And how do you know that?" "Because I've seen it before," she replied, meeting his gaze. "Years ago, during Shadow Strike, we encountered the same setup. Same patterns, same tactics. These people don't change their methods, they refine them. Trust me, if you want to find them, start there." The room was dead quiet. No one moved or spoke for several seconds. Then, slowly, the lead analyst nodded. "She's right," he muttered, studying the map more closely. "It matches the intel we've been gathering." From that moment on, things shifted. The young officer stopped questioning her, and others began treating her with a newfound respect. She became more than just a source of information. She became a leader, guiding the team through complex strategies and offering solutions no one else had considered. But it wasn't easy. As much as she tried to focus on the mission, the weight of her past kept pulling her back. Nights were the hardest. When the lights went out and the hum of computers faded, she was left alone with her thoughts. Memories she'd buried long ago resurfaced, vivid and unrelenting. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, reliving moments she wished she could forget. During the day, she masked her struggles well, keeping her composure in front of the team. But late at night, when everyone else had gone home, she'd sit by herself in the dimly lit facility, staring at the emblem on her wrist. It had become both a reminder of her sacrifices and a symbol of her resilience. Touching it lightly, she'd whisper to herself, "You've come this far. Don't stop now." Despite the emotional toll, she refused to let herself falter. This wasn't just about redemption. It was about protecting innocent lives. And as the pieces of the puzzle came together, the stakes grew higher. One evening, while reviewing surveillance footage, the team discovered something chilling. A convoy of vehicles was moving through a remote desert region, heading toward what appeared to be a heavily fortified compound. The timing matched perfectly with the pattern she had identified earlier. It was clear. This was the enemy's new base of operations. "We need to act fast," the man who had first approached her said urgently. "If we wait too long, they'll disappear again." She nodded, her jaw tightening. "Then we moved tonight." Planning the operation took hours. Maps were marked, routes plotted, and contingencies discussed. She insisted on being part of the mission, despite objections from some members of the team. "I'm not sitting this one out," she said firmly. "I've been here every step of the way. You'll need me on the ground." Her determination silenced any further protests. By dawn, the team was ready. Armed with advanced technology and precise intelligence, they set out for the desert. Their nerves taut with anticipation. As they approached the compound under cover of darkness, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of déjà vu. The dry air, the endless sand dunes, the faint glow of distant lights, it all felt eerily familiar. Years ago, she'd walked this path before under very different circumstances. Back then, she'd been part of a unit, surrounded by comrades who had her back. Now she was leading a team of strangers, carrying the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. When they reached the perimeter, she signaled for silence. The plan was simple: infiltrate, gather evidence, and neutralize the threat without alerting. Reinforcements. Easier said than done, especially when dealing with enemies known for their cunning and brutality. Creeping through the shadows, she guided the team toward the heart of the compound. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. Her training kicked in automatically, overriding fear and doubt. She remembered everything: the hand signals, the stealth techniques, the split-second decisions that could mean life or death. Inside the main building, they found exactly what they were looking for: stacks of weapons, communication equipment, and files detailing future plans. But there was something else, a name scrawled on a whiteboard, written in bold letters. It sent a chill down her spine. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, yet it haunted her dreams. "They're rebuilding," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't just about revenge. They're planning something bigger." Before anyone could respond, alarms blared, shattering the silence. They'd been discovered. Chaos erupted as guards swarmed the area, shouting orders and firing shots. The team scrambled to defend themselves, retreating toward their extraction point. Through the chaos, she remained calm, her instincts taking over. She directed the team with precision, ensuring everyone stayed safe while completing their objectives. Bullets whizzed past, explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet, but she didn't flinch. This was her element, the place where she thrived. By the time they reached the rendezvous point, the compound was engulfed in flames. Their mission had succeeded, but the cost was high. One member of the team was injured, and exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone. Still, they had accomplished what they set out to do. The enemy's plans were disrupted, and critical intelligence was secured. Back at the facility, debriefing stretched late into the night. Analysts pored over the evidence collected, piecing together the full scope of the threat. The woman sat quietly in the corner, watching as the puzzle came together. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. But she also knew this wasn't the end. The enemy might have been weakened, but they weren't defeated. There would be more battles ahead, more secrets to uncover. And she was ready. As the sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light across the room, she glanced at the emblem on her wrist one last time. It was a mark of survival, of sacrifice, and now of hope. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it, not as a washed-up soldier, but as someone who had risen from the ashes to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The days following the raid on the desert compound were a blur of activity. The team returned to the secure facility, battered but victorious. For the woman from Pine Ridge, though, there was little time to rest. The evidence they had gathered painted an alarming picture, one that demanded immediate action. This wasn't just about dismantling a single enemy cell. It was about stopping a network that had been growing in the shadows for years. Back at the facility, analysts worked around the clock, processing files, decrypting communications, and mapping out connections between individuals and locations. Every piece of information seemed to lead to more questions, unraveling a web far larger than anyone had anticipated. And through it all, she remained at the center of it, guiding, explaining, and connecting dots that others couldn't see. Evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, She sat alone in the briefing room. Maps covered the walls, red pins marking key points across continents. It was overwhelming, even for someone with her experience. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle over her. This wasn't supposed to be her life anymore. Years ago, she had walked away from this world, vowing never to look back. Yet here she was, knee-deep in battles she thought were long over. Part of her resented it, the intrusion into her quiet existence, the constant reminders of a past she'd tried so hard to forget. But another part of her felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. This fight gave her purpose again, something bigger than herself to hold on to. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. It was the man who had first approached her in Pine Ridge, the one who had dragged her back into this mess. He entered the room quietly, pulling up a chair beside her without saying a word. Together, they stared at the maps, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "You've done more than we could have asked for," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "No one expected you to step up like this." She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't have a choice. None of us did." He nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words. "Still, you've earned their respect. That's not easy to do around here." She glanced at him sideways, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Respect isn't what I'm after. I just want this to end." "It will," he assured her. "But it's going to take everything we've got." Over the next few days, the operation intensified. Plans were drawn up, resources allocated, and teams assembled. What started as a small investigation had grown into a full-scale effort involving multiple agencies and departments. At the heart of it all was her knowledge, her instincts, her unshakable determination. But leadership came with its own challenges. Not everyone agreed with her methods, and tension sometimes flared within the group. Some argued that her strategies were too risky, while others believed she was holding back vital information. She navigated these conflicts carefully, always keeping the mission in mind. There was no room for ego or personal grievances, not when lives were at stake. One particularly heated argument erupted during a strategy meeting. A senior officer questioned her decision to focus on a seemingly minor outpost located deep in Hottins and deep in Fenjer, mountainous terrain. Why waste resources on something so insignificant? He demanded, slamming his fist on the table. We should be hitting their main hubs instead. She stood up, her expression calm but firm. Because that insignificant outpost is where they're testing new weapons, she explained, pointing to a grainy photograph pinned to the wall. If we don't stop them now, those weapons will end up in cities, targeting civilians. Trust me, I've seen how this plays out. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. After a pause, the lead analyst nodded. She's right. We can't afford to ignore it. As the preparations continued, she found herself reflecting on the people around her, the young officers eager to prove themselves, the seasoned veterans. Hardened by years of service, the analysts buried under mountains of data. Each of them carried their own burdens, their own reasons for being here. In a strange way, they reminded her of her old unit, the comrades she had lost during Shadow Strike. It was both comforting and painful to see echoes of them in the faces of those working alongside her now. The night before the final operation, she couldn't sleep. She wandered through the empty halls of the facility, her footsteps muffled by the carpeted floors. Memories flooded her mind, faces she hadn't seen in decades, voices she'd never hear again. She stopped in front of a window, staring out at the darkened city beyond. Somewhere out there, ordinary people were living their lives, unaware of the danger lurking just out of sight. Protecting them. That was why she was here. The next morning, the team assembled at dawn, their expressions grim but determined. They loaded into vehicles, heading toward the mountains where the outpost was hidden. The journey was treacherous, winding roads carved into cliff sides and narrow passes barely wide enough for their trucks. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder and the tension thicker. When they reached the base of the mountain, she led the way on foot, guiding the team through dense forests and rocky paths. Every step brought them closer to their target, but also closer to potential disaster. Enemy patrols roamed the area, and one wrong move could give away their position. Hours later, they arrived at the edge of the outpost. Through binoculars, she scanned the compound, taking in every detail. Guards patrolled the perimeter, armed and alert. Inside, technicians worked tirelessly, assembling weapons that glinted menacingly under the harsh lights. Her jaw tightened. This was it, the culmination of weeks of planning and sacrifice. "We go in at midnight," she whispered to the team, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Stick to the plan, and we'll get out alive." As darkness fell, they moved into position, hearts pounding in anticipation. Time seemed to slow as they waited for the signal. When it came, a single flash of light cutting through the night, they sprang into action. The assault was swift and precise. They breached the perimeter silently, taking out guards before they could raise the alarm. Inside, chaos erupted as the team split up, securing rooms and disabling equipment. Flames licked at the walls as explosives detonated, destroying the weapons before they could be deployed. Through it all, she stayed focused, her movements fluid and calculated. Years of training and survival instinct guided her every step. When the evacuation order came, she ensured everyone made it out safely, bringing up the rear as they retreated into the forest by sunrise. They were miles away, watching as smoke billowed into the sky behind them. Exhaustion weighed heavily on the team, but relief washed over them too. They had done it, they had stopped the threat, at least for now. Back at the facility, celebrations were subdued. There was still work to be done, loose ends to tie up. But for the first time in weeks, there was hope. The tide was turning, thanks in large part to the woman who had risen from obscurity to become a leader none of them had expected as she stood. In the briefing room once more, looking at the maps now dotted with green pins indicating successful operations, she allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't the life she had chosen, but it was the one she had embraced. And maybe, just maybe, it was the life she was meant to live all along. The aftermath of the operation brought a strange mix of emotions. The woman from Pine Ridge felt a sense of relief, like she could finally breathe again, but it was tinged with sadness. She had spent weeks pushing herself to the limit, reliving old wounds and forging new ones along the way. Now that the immediate threat was neutralized, she couldn't help but wonder what came next. Was this truly the end? Or just another chapter in a story that refused to close? At the facility, life began returning to some semblance of normalcy. Analysts packed away files, officers debriefed their teams, and equipment was stored for future use. For most, the mission was over a job well done, a victory celebrated quietly before moving on to whatever came next. But for her, things weren't so simple. This wasn't just a mission. It was a reckoning. It forced her to confront parts of herself she'd buried long ago, pieces of her identity she thought she'd left behind. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows of the briefing room, the man who had first approached her walked in carrying a folder. He looked tired but satisfied, his usual stern demeanor softened by gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you," he said simply, placing the folder on the table between them. "You've earned your place here, if you want it." She stared at him, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the offer. A few months ago, she'd been shelving books in a quiet library, living a life as far removed from this world as possible. Now, She was being asked to step into a role she hadn't even considered: a leader, an advisor, someone whose voice mattered in rooms filled with powerful people. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about titles or recognition. It was about purpose. Over the past weeks, she'd rediscovered something she hadn't realized she'd lost: a reason to keep fighting. And while she wasn't sure if she belonged in this world anymore, she couldn't deny the pull it had on her. "I'll think about it," she replied after a pause, her tone measured but sincere. "But for now, I need to go home." He nodded, understanding written across his face. "Take your time. You've earned that much." When she returned to Pine Ridge, the town seemed unchanged. The same oak trees lined the streets, the bakery still smelled of fresh bread, and her neighbors greeted her with polite smiles. To them, she was the same person who had slipped quietly into their lives. Years ago, the librarian who kept to herself and rarely caused a stir. They didn't know about the battles she'd fought, the lives she'd saved, or the scars she carried, both visible and invisible. For the first few days, she tried to settle back into her routine. She went to work, helped kids find books, and spent evenings sipping tea on her porch. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't the same person who had left Pine Ridge weeks earlier. She had seen too much, done too much, to ever fully return to the quiet simplicity she once cherished. Still, there were moments when peace found her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, she sat alone in her backyard. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. She rolled up her sleeve, exposing the emblem tattooed on her wrist. It was faded now, almost blending with her skin, but its significance remained undiminished. This mark had defined her for so long, first as a soldier, then as a survivor, and now as someone who had risen above the label of washed up. It wasn't just a symbol of pain or loss anymore. It was proof that she had endured, that she had faced unimaginable challenges and come out stronger on the other side. Word eventually spread around Pine Ridge about her involvement in stopping a major threat. How exactly the news got out, she never knew, but soon enough, whispers turned into open admiration. Neighbors who had once dismissed her as unremarkable now greeted her with respect. Kids at the library asked wide-eyed questions about spies and secret missions, and local newspapers hinted at her heroics without revealing too many details. First, the attention made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not in a place where she had always preferred anonymity. But over time, she learned to accept it, not because she craved recognition, but because it reminded her of why she had fought in the first place. People mattered. Their safety, their freedom, their ability to live without fear, all of it was worth protecting. A few months later, she received a letter from the facility. Inside was an invitation to join a special advisory board tasked with addressing emerging threats. It wasn't a demand or an order, it was a choice. They respected her decision to stay in Pine Ridge, but they also recognized her value. Her insights, her instincts, her resilience, they were assets the world couldn't afford to lose. She read the letter several times, weighing her options carefully. On one hand, she loved the quiet life she had built in Pine Ridge. On the other, she knew she couldn't turn her back on the responsibilities she had taken on. The fight wasn't over, and maybe it never would be. But that didn't mean she had to give up everything she held dear. In the end, she decided on a compromise. She would serve as an occasional consultant, offering guidance when needed but maintaining her independence. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it allowed her to honor both sides of herself: the quiet librarian who found joy in small-town life and the resilient warrior who refused to let the world burn. As time passed, she became a legend in her own right, not because of grand gestures or flashy achievements, but because of the quiet strength she carried within her. People in Pine Ridge spoke of her with pride, marveling at how someone so ordinary could achieve something so extraordinary. Strangers sought her advice, young soldiers looked up to her as a role model, and leaders listened intently whenever she spoke. Yet despite the accolades, she remained humble. She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as someone who had done what needed to be done. Heroes, she believed, weren't defined by medals or titles. They were defined by the choices they made when no one was watching, by the sacrifices they were willing to endure for the greater good. And perhaps that's what made her story so compelling. She wasn't larger than life, she was human. Flawed, scarred, and imperfect, yet capable of greatness when it mattered most. In a world often dominated by noise and chaos, she stood as a reminder that true strength lies not in power or fame, but in courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right. Years later, when asked about her journey, she would smile softly and say, "I'm just a person who answered the call when it came. Nothing more, nothing less." And though her words were simple, they carried the weight of a lifetime lived with purpose.